the thing that matters most to us is our connection to other people. And while we don't talk about that perhaps in the workplace, we certainly don't talk about when it doesn't go well, except we go home or we go to a therapist or a coach. But the reality is that that's what's really it's the biggest driver of stress or wellness or well-being and creativity, is whether we feel safely connected to others. So we're trying to bring this into some kind of accessible, usable business discourse, right? The whole idea of boundless leadership, in a way, is giving us a language and a way of working with the inner domain of our inside job of leading ourselves and others.
Hi, I'm Derik Mills. Welcome to the Glow Podcast. When you think of a leader, who comes to mind? Most people might think of someone who is a boss, maybe someone who doesn't take no for an answer, or maybe someone whose leadership style creates a culture that runs on stress, fear, and drama. Well, thankfully, the concept of leadership is changing. Leaders are discovering healthier and more effective ways of connecting in the work environment, and more people are looking to work with companies that are intentional about creating and investing in the internal structures that support more conscious ways of behaving and operating as teams. Dr. Joe Loizzo is the co-author, along with Elazar Aslan, of a new book called Boundless Leadership. Together, they examine leadership from the inside out, first asking leaders to work with our own nervous systems, our interior lives, to ultimately help us become more creative, embodied, and compassionate leaders. As many of us have experienced, both within ourselves and with others, traditional methods of leadership have tended to run on stress and assumptions about stress. But Joe reminds us that we can pivot to a kind of leadership that focuses on co-creating a psychologically safe and constructive environment. So far this year on the Glow Podcast, we've had conversations about self-care, resilience, and doing the work to be better humans. But this episode marks the first time we're bringing these ideas into the workplace and having a look at how boundless leadership can help us expand our idea of ourselves as co-workers, as teammates. I first read Fred Kaufman's book, Conscious Business, back in 2009, and have ever since been interested in this work. I love this topic because I find leadership to be a never-ending inward journey of improving my own interior life and learning from my mistakes and successes as we co-create meaningful work and meaningful relationships. I see myself as a never-ending work in progress with always lots to learn. And so I'm grateful for people like Joe and Elazar and many others that are doing this kind of work that, say, 10 years ago, maybe plus or minus a few years, was truly considered weird and fringe and not appropriate for the workplace. I'm grateful for them. They are the helpful guides we can all learn from to help us together navigate our way to healthier work environments. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Joe Loizzo. Dr. Loizzo, it's so wonderful to be here with you today. Thank you for coming on.
Derik, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah, me too. So you and Elazar Aslan have a book coming out on December 21st. You can pre-order it now, and we'll put a link to that in our show notes. It's called Boundless Leadership, the breakthrough method to realize your vision, empower others, and ignite positive change. Thank you so much for the advanced copy. It was incredibly helpful to read it before this. It's 250 pages of a lot of information. It's dense. I got through it in about 2 weeks, but I recommend people spend more time than that because not every chapter, but most chapters end with a practice, and there's just a lot in there. And yeah, I just so much enjoyed being with it over that time period. And a book like this, even though it has the word leadership in the title, it's truly for everyone. It's self-leadership. You don't need to be a manager or founder. If you're a human and you interact with other humans and you interact with our planet, this is for you. If you're invested in or interested in this never-ending process of being a better human. And it's something that you and Elazar have mapped out and taught over the past 12 years together. And I know we'll get into some of the specific critical skills and competencies, but I just want to say one point before we turn it over to you. And that's just a brief note about this work in terms of the work environment. It is just so clear that what you've written about and what we'll discuss today, that this is the future. Like, we're already starting to see it happen. More and more people, companies out there want to work with people and companies that are scaling and operationalizing this way of being with each other. So it's just so exciting. And I'm grateful the two of you wrote this book. And I know you have a program that supports the material in this book, and we can get into that towards the end of our conversation. So I guess as a starting point, if you want to comment on anything I said, or why a book on leadership, and maybe share a bit of your background with us.
Okay, great. Thanks, Derik. I'm so glad I can hear that you've visited with Boundless Leadership, and I'm glad you've enjoyed your journey thus far. I'm a psychiatrist by training. I mostly do psychotherapy. A lot of, I work a lot with people around their work lives. Of course, we spend so much time at work. And one of the key methods that I've learned to help people access potential, overcome obstacles, build resilience, and so on is the meditative approaches, the contemplative approaches. So in terms of my partnership with Elazar, we met after he read a blog I was doing on a tricycle magazine for a while on the science of enlightenment. Really just looking at our potential. When I talk about enlightenment, really talking about our full human potential. And he, of course, brings a more conventional business background, Wharton trained and so on, and had been moving toward being an executive coach. And so he and I, sort of overlapped around the area of the power of contemplative practice to really help people transform. So this is really what the book is about, is if I love that you instantly got that this is for everyone, because our take really is that the world is changing so fast and in so many converging ways that we can't, one leader isn't enough, anywhere. We all need to have a larger sense of the whole. And in fact, I think this is something that really thinking about your own full agency as a human, your own contribution, your potential, your power to impact your life and others is something that we don't do enough of in our modern culture, in any discipline, whether that be in healthcare or in business. So we really felt this was a time when the world needed a different approach to how each of us can be more of a leader, empower ourselves to be more of a leader for ourselves, but also bring a whole new way of being, as you suggest, to our interactions with others, our work life, our community, maybe social engagement. That's our hope.
To know where we're going, I guess it helps to know from where we've come. You mentioned conventional approach. You contrast in the book boundless leadership with the flawed traditional approach to leadership. I guess maybe before we dive into boundless leadership, can you summarize the flawed conventional approach?
Sure. I think that our whole business culture has, evolved over centuries, right? It goes back to Adam Smith or whoever. And I don't think in the beginning that the founders of modern economics or modern, entrepreneurial thinking had any idea how powerful businesses would become. And I think that one of the things that's happened over the last century is that businesses have become the dominant force on the planet. And meanwhile, the way business leaders are conventionally trained, and again, I emphasize the word leaders there, not in the sense we're using it, but in the conventional sense, is as being sort of the one person who's going to whip everybody else into shape or make it all happen and get all the credit or take all the responsibility, but also get all the credit and the rewards. And this sort of hyper individual understanding that businesses really needed these one exceptional leader, and not another key aspect really of how different our approach is, or how is that the understanding is that leaders really brought a certain kind of confidence, perhaps panache, drive, okay, but mainly sort of knowledge and skills that it wasn't. It's almost like a technocratic notion of what leadership is. You understand how economics work, you understand how markets work, and so on. So over the years, as leadership has evolved, it's mainly been by building in like new modules of knowledge and skill, like applying the same basic way of being, which is who I am really doesn't matter. What matters is what I know and how I can make things happen or make other people do things. And that notion of the leader as a kind of highly trained technocratic or skilled executive really doesn't fly anymore. First, because, as I said, businesses have so much more impact over our lives and our way of being than ever before. And so they're really having huge impacts that are ethical in nature, that have, potential sort of impacts on our state of consciousness, our health and well-being. They're not just producing widgets, right? They're really, in a way, producing our whole way of life. And so if you don't have the understanding of, the whole breadth of, what is important in choosing a direction, right, for yourself and for others, what is important in moving things in a particular direction, if you don't get access to, an understanding of, what well-being is, right? What's real health and well-being? What's sustainable way of living as a human? What kinds of interface or interaction with our customers or other the global networks that we're engaged with, or the larger society? What's the social impact of what we're doing? If you don't have the basic training for that, you're really not prepared to and as you can see, many of our most powerful CEOs, people like Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos or whatever, boys with toys, they have superpower at their disposal, but they have no training to warrant the level of responsibility and impact that they have. And of course, it's not good for them either, because, it's, I'm sure, enormous amount of stress and alienating people in those leadership positions from others. So that's part of the whole new approach, is that we're not having this one leader, top-down reptilian organization. One of my colleagues, Stephen Porges, is a scientist, a researcher of the autonomic nervous system, and he talks about what happened when we became mammals. And one of the things that happened is that our whole brainstem changed. It grew a new module, a new module that allows us to stay connected even under enormous stress. Unfortunately, we also default to the reptilian way of being, where we're not really connected to others and we're not really aware of our interconnection or impact. And that's a mode that I also call the survival mode, that is extremely stress prone. We're sort of stress magnets in that mode. And then in addition, it's a mode that alienates us from others because we're losing our mammal capacity to stay coordinated with others. So, reptilian or dinosauric leadership is leadership where, stress is the fuel rather than something we want to metabolize and transform. And where it's a kind of top-down model where one person is sort of, coercing or driving everybody to move in the same direction. And of course, you can see how antiquated that is in terms of, our interdependent workplace, life world, markets, everything is so interdependent. And the main tool that we have for this as humans, the capacity that at all levels of our brain to live, work, process information, create together with others in an open creative loop, that's shut down. When we use stress as a method, we're cutting ourselves off from our capacity to connect with others. And hence, we're cutting ourselves off from the main source of wealth and productivity as well, not to mention the main source of fun, meaning, purpose, right? We're just cutting it right off. There's that understanding that, if we, think of the leader as like a military leader, which is one of the, sort of prototypes of the old model of leadership, we're really not using the right neurobiological tools for the job. And we're not only putting stress on that one person who gets identified or that small group of people that rise to the top, but we're actually really ensuring that everyone else is disengaged, maybe feeling frightened or stressed or burnt out. And that we're certainly not tapping their full potential. Not only are we not tapping everybody's full well-being, we're certainly not tapping their potential. So the main sort of focus that, one very simple way of thinking about this is that in the old style of leadership, the human being doesn't matter. Your human qualities and your human way of being doesn't really matter. It's like you just have to know things and be able to do things. But our ability to connect with others is a fundamental dimension of our humanity. And if we don't have that, then we really can't be effective leaders in our hyper-connected age. And so the reality is, boundless leadership, as opposed to the traditional model, is really helping us shift our fundamental way of being as humans who are leading ourselves and others in the world. And it's that focus on our human potential or capacity that makes this such a radically new approach.
A lot of threads for me to pull on there. Boys with toys and the process of growing up and becoming an adult leads me to think about the importance that you put on the inner conditions and the inner work. You have a few sentences towards the beginning of the book where you refer to boundless leadership as not predicated upon more skills or better command of business principles, which is what you were saying, but rather upon an unrelenting pursuit of optimizing the inner conditions, the way of being underlying our thoughts, feelings, and actions. And then another thread, which resonates with another sentence shortly thereafter, that as boundless leaders, we want to nurture people to be their best through engagement and inspiration rather than through compliance and fear. And you mentioned the framing of old way of doing things was, how do we make people do things? And you just really can't make people do things unless you want to create an environment, as you said, of fear and insecurity and so many other dysfunctional ways of being together. And as we, I think, now shift to the inner conditions and the inner work, so much then follows. But I think one key word, concept, practice that maybe we need to get a definition out of the way first is mindfulness. And I love that you call out that the current popular definitions of mindfulness, I can only speak to here in North America that I'm familiar with in terms of the popular version of the definition of mindfulness. Not to say that I'm not familiar with a variety of texts that come way before the popular version of that definition. You say amounts to less than 5% of the traditional ancient methodology that modern science is proving to be so effective for retraining the human mind brain for flourishing, and that the actual practice of mindfulness is much more ambitious and complex. So how do you define mindfulness?
Great question, Derik. So mindfulness, the traditional understanding is that it is about, so let's just say with a small m, mindfulness as a, moment-to-moment capacity is about remembering or being aware of what you're trying to focus on. Basically, it's about sort of just being self-aware, right? We relate this in the Boundless Leadership program to developing the capacity for self-awareness. So I know where my mind is. That's what mindfulness. I know what it's doing right now. Part of that is the assumption that if I get distracted from what I'm doing, I remember what I was trying to do and I come back to it. So that's why the word mindfulness, smrti or sati in the ancient languages, literally is the same word that's used for memory or recollection. As a practice, though, the word that's used to describe the whole practice in which mindfulness is embedded as a technique or training is vipassana, which means insight. And so where, the modern sort of mindfulness revolution, or mindfulness, as one of my students likes to say, understanding, a popularized, diluted understanding of mindfulness, where that comes in is it's sort of basic, paying attention in the present moment, right? So just being able to consciously attend, intentionally noticing, being self-aware, whatever your mind or body or whatever is doing. That's the definition, like the power of now, for example, as it become another sort of buzzword that's out there. But the actual, and that's seen as kind of like it. If you're in the present moment, then you're mindful. And the reality is, of course, what happens if you're in the present moment and it's awful and you're miserable or you're really not functioning well at all?
Right.
And what happens if you have a whole string of those present moments, one after another, or they even get worse? The purpose of mindfulness is much more ambitious. It's to really be able to get the data about, right? So we want fresh, direct, clean data about where my mind and body or experience or life are right now. But then we want to have the capacity to work creatively with that. And that's why the word vipassana comes in, which is a Pali and Sanskrit word for insight. So the idea is that really the traditional way of thinking about mindfulness is that it's really a training of your attention that empowers you to consciously learn or relearn your way of being and living, right? So it's about learning, and learning both in the context of seeing and noticing more, like wisdom or insight, and also learning in the context of being more caring or concerned or engaged. And so that's in the context of kindness and compassion. Both of those ways of learning how to lead yourself, basically, right? To know where you are and know where you want to head, are essential to the full understanding of mindfulness, which has a number of dimensions that we go over in Boundless Leadership. I mean, another a bigger reply to your question is that from the standpoint of the tradition that gave us mindfulness and the whole even this psychology I'm describing, this whole meditative practice of being able to steer your own ship, sort of correct the course of your life, is only one of the many technologies that are available, right? So there's what I call the other two waves, which have to do with compassion, right? Learning how to take a kind of more creative role in your relationships with others in the world. And then embodiment, learning how to work with your own nervous system at the most primal gut visceral level, and fundamentally rewire your mind-body state. So mindfulness, as presently taught, is a small fraction of even the methodology of mindfulness in the Indic tradition. And then we have these other two huge methodologies that are even more complex and powerful.
Yeah, we're going to lead into learning and compassion next. I wonder if it's just briefly important here to note your background in terms of contemplative practice, particularly your PhD, I believe, was in Buddhism.
Yeah, well,
because an appreciation for this vast body of work and practice is incredibly difficult to come by. And it's so easy, as I think we'll get into as we explore negativity bias and shame avoidance and embodied stress energy. It's really easy to kind of default to a non-nuanced point of view because that's what's easier to do. The harder work is to get to the place where you're at in order to make some of these statements. So I think it's really important if there's anything you want to say about your experience, your past, in terms of your understanding of these contemplative practices.
Sure. I mean, I'll say something even in a way, a larger sort of a confession about me, right? So that part of the way I got into this unusual intersection of fields, right? This new field that didn't exist for, when I started, was watching my dad, who was a physician, burn out over the course of his otherwise very rewarding profession. And what I realized is that he didn't have the tools to really guide his own way of working, living, and it really cost him. And, at the same time, I had in my own household double-blind experiment, my mom was a much more retained some of her traditional upbringing in spirituality and stayed and much more related and close to it and practiced, and actually kind of grew more secure, more alive, and flourished more over the years. So from a very young age, I realized that if I was going to go into healthcare, mental health, well-being, I really needed to bring in something from the contemplative traditions of the world that we've jettisoned basically over the last centuries. So I did train in medicine and psychiatry, but as early as college, I ran into the whole Buddhist or Indic contemplative philosophy, psychology, and methodology, which just blew my mind, right? Because it was right there. Unlike a lot of Western religious or contemplative practices, the Indic tradition is presented is open to science, is open to psychology. It's very set up as a methodology that's kind of neutral. That's tradition neutral or neutral to your worldview. So it's something that anyone can use. And so that really gave me a sense of how I would bridge where, medicine, neuroscience, neuropsychology, and all of these things were going, and the contemplative world, which otherwise would be quite a stretch. And it wasn't really I started out my studies in this, and I have to date myself, I guess, in the 70s, and did my first trips to India in the 70s. But this was not a common popular interest. I met John Kabat-Zinn and Herb Benson, worked in Herb's lab, but still there wasn't really until the 90s. This whole thing was kind of just weird. And so I think what happened around the time when some of the first hardcore research on the benefits of mindfulness came along is that it lined up with what we were learning in neuroscience, which is that, in fact, the brain wasn't fixed and hardwired, that it was plastic and trainable. And so these two discoveries came together to sort of break open the mindfulness revolution, that we had methods of training the mind that could be secular, that could be tradition neutral, that anyone could use, had health impacts and so on, and that we could also use them. They were very powerful tools to transform the way our minds and bodies and brains work. So at that point, I wanted to continue studying the ancient Indic tradition to be able to really responsibly and reliably get as much of the wealth as possible, but also really be able to frame it in a way that wasn't leaving out anything essential. Right. And that's part of, even I know I've had this conversation with John Kabat-Zinn, who regrets in a lot of ways not including other elements into his original mindfulness-based stress reduction. But that we're sort of making up for that now. So I did end up coming back to study with Bob Thurman, the same professor I've met in college at Columbia, and do a PhD in Buddhist psychology, and how it related to their understanding of the nervous system, the transformability of the mind, and I think it's an extremely rich. I'm so glad I did that, because it really allowed me to go deeper, but also gave the world time in a way to get more interested, so that by the time I started doing my practical applications, there was a hunger for this kind of stuff. And as I said, I think it may be that mindfulness with a small m, is not as hot as it was, and that people are shifting focus, but there's so much that's yet to be discovered. And the fact is, just actually applying these practices, these powerful mind training practices, responsibly and with maximal impact, right? That's part of what we're going for in Boundless Leadership.
Nice. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. I hope to spend these next 30 minutes talking about topics that are typically uncomfortable to talk about in the work environment, and typically not thought of as concepts that are critical to integrate into the work environment. And so much that I've seen in the past. I started Glow back in 2008, and I've made plenty of mistakes over the years, and we're at a point now where I can honestly say we're learning from those mistakes and making meaningful change. And there are so many entry points into this next part of this conversation that I could choose, but you mentioned learning and compassion. And I think the three main blocks, so you talk about three strategic pivots, going from critical mind to open mind, careful heart to caring heart, guarded energy and stance to fluid energy and stance, and that those pivots each have certain blocks. I don't think respectively. I think you can have those blocks across all three, and those being negativity, bias, shame avoidance, and embodied stress energy. And I don't think you can accomplish those pivots and establish a learning environment if you're not also creating a safe environment where those three main blocks are okay to work with. So I wonder if we could just talk about compassion for a moment, because it's such a misunderstood term. I think you mentioned that too in the book. And one of the things when our team was at the height of its toxicity, people would walk into our office and say, "God, it's so nice here. Everyone's so nice." And it wasn't until years of work and working through that I came to realize that a nice culture can in fact be just as toxic as an overtly not nice culture for a variety of reasons. And I think part of what I love about your framing of compassion is that you mention that compassion often figures in our modern worldview as a moralistic injunction or a self-indulgent sentiment, and that the way you're talking about it is in direct opposition to this flawed leadership approach. And so I'm just wondering what is compassion, and why is it so hard to lead with compassion? You also talk about authentic and inauthentic compassion. I just don't want to spend the rest of the 30 minutes on this particular word. I wonder if there's a shorter version of that.
Well, great. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that we need that all of this capacity, accessing our mammalian capacity, our capacity to connect with others creatively and authentically and so on, requires a sense of safety. And safety is not something one human being can experience alone. Again, the same researcher that I mentioned, Stephen Porges, says absence of danger is not enough for a mammal to feel safe. Why? Because our lives really depend on our relationships with others, and so what we need in order to really feel safe, mind, body, neurologically, is cues of safety and connection, messages, explicit, intentional messages that we're recognized as valuable, worthwhile humans treated with respect and care. And when you listen to that kind of description, it doesn't sound like any corporation that we're used to, right? And it's not an accident, actually. Part of the way our corporate culture evolved, or our whole business culture evolved, was with a kind of misguided neo-Darwinism, a misguided understanding that Darwin believed that somehow the tougher the animal, that survival was about individual animals fighting with each other, and the toughest one will win. And I think there is that kind of ethos built into our sense of what a good leader is, like really, hard-nosed, aggressive, maybe even like greed is good, right? This somebody driven by these powerful engines. But what we really have learned over the last 50 years is that it's all wrong, that whole basic framework. And it wasn't even what Darwin believed. It wasn't even what Adam Smith believed, frankly, right? But all of them were really very aware of the importance of the social dimension of human life as a foundation, and the social dimension of animal life as a foundation for our competence and our survivability, right? It's certainly a foundation for our thriving. So the understanding is that whatever compassion is, however we define it, it isn't a luxury. It isn't about being nice. If we want to unlock the full potential that we have as the most complex, the most amazing animals ever, right? We need to feel safely connected to others, and that requires a spirit, mood, energy we call compassion. And what is that? It's a sense that your happiness and my happiness are linked, that your suffering and my suffering are linked, and that it's completely opposite the culture that I described of traditional leadership, where it's the exceptional individual who gets the prize and everyone else is just supporting cast. And in fact, actually, we know now that's not a prize, right? We know that individual, wealth, success, and all of these things are not what make people happy or well. That it's connection to others. And so really what we're talking about is acknowledging what decades of science has shown us, and the good news being that we can cultivate what we call wise compassion or authentic compassion. That is, we can cultivate the capacity to connect with others in a way that works, in a way that's not sentimental, that's not about being nice, and it doesn't make us suffer either. That actually enriches. It's a win-win. It enriches everyone because it brings the best out in all of us.
Okay, so as we're cultivating the capacity for meaningful connection through wise compassion, and then looping back to the 3 pivots I mentioned earlier, you write, those 3 pivots all depend on one shift. That is a shift from a stress-driven way of being to a thriving way of being. Can you speak to that shift in terms of both negativity bias and the traumatized sense of self?
So one overall way to think about the shift from the conventional business as usual, leadership as usual, to the kind of leadership that we're calling boundless, is that leadership as usual is traditionally seen as very intimately tied to stress and assumptions about stress, that somehow stress is necessary, that it's good, that it drives us to excellence and to perform well, and that it's not something we can actually get rid of. And actually, this is one of the beautiful things about modern neuroscience, positive psychology, and a whole trend, a whole new way of understanding human nature, is that we're understanding that stress is just one mode of the human nervous system, and that we're actually capable of pivoting or shifting to a whole different mode that's more about thriving with others and co-creating, a safe and creative and constructive environment. So, because stress operates at all different levels of our mind and body, we have stress reactive thinking, which is tinged with negativity. Worst case, we call that negativity bias. That's the sort of bias that we bring to our thinking habits when we're feeling stressed. Emotional reactivity is tied to what we call the traumatized sense of self. That is a sense of not being safely connected to others, which we all is a sort of painful truth and often too much of a secret for all of us. And then our guarded stance, our fight, flight, faint, freeze kind of way of living in our body when we're sort of running on the dirty fuel of stress, right? All of those three levels of stress, of the stress way of being, are baked in or tied into the traditional leadership model and are seen as unavoidable. But modern research has lined up with ancient contemplative traditions to say, hey, no, that's just the downside. That's the bad side. And we can actually shift. If we practice, we can actually shift that survival mode that locks us into the stress way of being, and we can learn to cultivate resilience, or the ability to bounce back at all these different levels, from stress reactive or negative thinking to optimistic, realistic assessment, open-mindedness, which is the heart of that. We can learn how to heal and unlock our traumatized sense of self so that we can let go of the fears of isolation or shame or exclusion that keep us all locked down and alienated. And we can shift into a sense of deep, authentic connection to others that frees us emotionally. And then we can also shift at the level of body stress. All right, so we can shift at the level of stress at the mind, heart, and body, and our practices in Boundless Leadership train the disciplines, the capacities to do those resilient shifts over and over again until we really fundamentally start adapting to living in a full thriving mode. So, those are basically, that's the overall logic of the system from a sort of scientific psychology standpoint. Is we now know we don't need that. The stress is not the clean energy. It's not the way to get the most productivity or creativity or certainly not fun or health out of us. And that we have this whole other mode that we're not tapping, because we as individuals, our institutions and our societies have been locked into stress and baked into stress for centuries.
Right. Absolutely. When I think of myself and the ways the dirty fuel of stress that you mentioned can manifest in myself, when I'm not aware of it, it tends to be in the form of, say, perfectionism, busyness, unnecessary intensity, and other unhelpful ways. And I try to now see those moments as opportunities to reflect on and be more receptive to what I'm feeling and why, and to honestly address my pain points or my pain avoidance tactics. That's much easier said than done. And the contemplative practices like those in your book, which support self-awareness, helps with that. Towards the end of the book, you also provide a method of locating yourself as to whether at the level of body, heart, mind, where am I at the moment on a particular issue, and you then provide the practices, as you mentioned, to move through those particular pivots.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the unique things about our methodology in Boundless Leadership is in a way it couldn't have happened. It wouldn't have been possible in 10 years ago or 20 years ago, let alone a century ago, because what we really do is we're able to sort of line up the science very clearly, and at the same time tap into this very broad range of contemplative practices, mind-body training practices that allow us to do these shift, to break the shift down into very incremental steps, right? So to make it accessible. So part of the reason why we really believe boundless leadership is for everybody is that we're able to take the new way of being that we're describing, right, with the traits that we're trying to cultivate, the traits of self-awareness that lead to clarity, the trait of, authentic engagement that comes from a heart that's in a place of compassion and connection, and the trait of natural flow or embodied flow that comes from working with our autonomic nervous system and our bodies. These traits we can then break down into states that we cultivate on a day-to-day regular basis until they get installed, right? States, practice over time, altered states or new states of being eventually get wired into new traits of being. And the states themselves, we can further break down into smaller incremental steps, that is, specific qualities that support those states, right? So for example, clarity we can support with presence of mind. We can support it with balance and so on and so forth, with unbiased awareness, and then specific practices that train those qualities. So we have a system where we're able to break this whole big shift down into very small incremental practices. And what you're alluding to, Derik, is once we have that map laid out, where we can sort of notice where we're most stuck, where's the biggest pain point? Is it my negative thinking? Is it my traumatic sense of myself as inadequate or reactive all the time? Is it a bodily kind of guarding and stress? We identify what domain our worst stresses are, and then we can focus on a specific set of practices that build qualities that counteract, that help us bounce back out of those stress modes and eventually get installed as a whole new way of being.
And I appreciate how you go to some pretty granular level, places that you typically don't go to in a work environment. So one of the subtitle to your chapter on resilience is transforming our inner demons. And, day to day, I'm sure people see it all the time with their coworkers, whether it be with a manager working with their direct report, or a direct report seeing it in their manager, like seeing in real time that person working with or navigating inner demons, that the other party feels it and sees it. For example, the experience of shame, insecurity, inadequacy, feeling disconnected from others or from ourselves, or some other aspect of ourselves that we'd rather not feel in that moment or reveal to others. Or maybe in the moment of being triggered, we may be self-aware enough to notice these emotions within ourselves. And depending on the relationship dynamic and the power dynamic, or whether or not it's a group setting, it takes a certain amount of metacognition to navigate all of that well in the moment, to determine what amount of disclosure or what ways of expressing that disclosure is appropriate. And I have a question here that it might take me a minute to get to. I wonder if we can explore for a moment the boundary between what is appropriate for the coaching setting in the work environment and what is better left for the licensed therapeutic setting. And part of why I ask is the relationship I have with our co-CEO is one where we can, without any risk or harm, we can discuss our childhood trauma, fears, our insecurities, particularly as we're weighing the pros and cons of a decision or coaching each other on either a future or past scenario. But the structure and norms of our relationship have been in development over the past 10 years, with the last few years in particular, with both of us working with the same coach. And I suspect that configuration is somewhat rare. And we often wonder, like, once we're done with or we're on there, we're through a session or a moment like that, we wonder, God, can you imagine how wonderful and powerful it would be if we could scale what we have together? And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that and just the traumatic self state and the wounded child, which you bring up in your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the heart is the heart of the matter, right? Why? Because we're such social animals. The thing that matters most to us is our connection to other people. And while we don't talk about that perhaps in the workplace, we certainly don't talk about when it doesn't go well, except we go home or we go to a therapist or a coach. But the reality is that that's what's really it's the biggest driver of stress or wellness or well-being and creativity, is whether we feel safely connected to others. So we're trying to bring this into some kind of accessible, usable business discourse, right? The whole idea of boundless leadership, in a way, is giving us a language and a way of working with the inner domain of our inside job of leading ourselves and others. And the key there is to just simply accept something that I think is not really very well known or accepted, that feelings of shame and inadequacy and insecurity and rejection are universal, are common human feelings, and are usually the single biggest limiting factor in our capacity to show up. And so the fact that we can't talk to our coworkers about this, or our reports or bosses or whatever, that we don't have a language for it, that it's taboo, that it might show weakness or vulnerability, all of this is really completely counterproductive. And what you're describing in your relationship with your co-director is the direction we need to head in, where everyone has a shame, a de-shaming, non-blaming, just general human understanding that this is the way a human heart works. And so, part of that is that we, because our main drive as mammals from infancy is to connect with other mammals, we know that that's more important to us than survival. It's more important than food, is connection. From day one, from the get-go. And also we know that in terms of motivating behavior, fear of shame is worse than fear of death, right? So these are many different ways of looking at the reality that when we feel rejected, disconnected, unlovable, unseen, it's very wounding, not just on a sensitive, emotional level. It fundamentally blocks our capacity to access our whole mammal self, our full resources, or to be resilient. So that's why shedding light on that, those moments or parts of our history, of our emotional history or emotional programming, where we came close to shame or feelings of rejection, is essential to really working out the kinks and getting through. And that's usually something that only happens in deep psychotherapy, but it's something that for most of us can happen in other contexts. With the right language and methodology, it can happen in coaching. And maybe you would also want to have, maybe you don't want to tell your coach exactly everything if they're working for your company. I don't know. But I mean, ideally, we would be able to use the language of boundless leadership to help, bring more of this sort of common human, no nonsense and non-blamey, non-shamey acceptance of, okay, that this is a wounded place where it's really hard for me, and here's how maybe we can work through this. What about for you? I think that if we can really accept that we need to face these wounds, we need to be able to share them and find the skills to work through them in order to get our full capacity, we'll have accepted, a huge shift in the capacity to access a sense of well-being and connection. I mean, if we can learn to do this in real time, to know when we're feeling shamed and threatened and disconnected, and to either ourselves through self-compassion work that kink out, or engage somebody else we trust to help us out of it, then we're right back to our full selves.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't wasted hours, days, months, or years locked up in a fear that we're not good enough, or that, nope, I'm not safe in this space or in this relationship.
Right. I've seen work relationships be so much more effective and healthy when in real time, in safe community, and in situation and context appropriate ways, the wounding is faced. I've also seen how badly it can go when the wounding isn't faced, or is faced without some tools that help set us up for success. I've seen that both in myself and in others. And I love how you put it, that this is a wounded place where it's really hard for me. And maybe here's how we can work through it. Like, how does that work for you? Adding in the asking permission component. I think how much time and energy is wasted by not facing the wounds, or in not knowing there are even wounds to be faced, all of which likely is adversely affecting our physiology, our relationships at home, disrupting our sleep, likely leading to certain unhealthy numbing behaviors, just a cascade of dysfunction. And then multiply that across whole economies.
And you multiply it by the social contagion factor, right? This is what psychologists call the way we subliminally impact each other under the radar. Your boss is in a bad mood because his kid or his wife were upset with him, or with her, whoever, and then you pick up on it. Everybody in the room picks up on it. Everybody in the room is in lockdown, fear-based. I better not. I got to look out. I can't trust. And we've just lost the potential that we need to solve problems, be creative, let alone enjoy and be well. So, and it happens all the time. It's such a bread and butter problem in our everyday lives. And what we now know is that this is really treatable and preventable. It's like we can train ourselves out of this if we have the kind of map and tools that Boundless Leadership offers.
I love that. I just want to say that I in no way consider myself beyond or exempt any of this. I encounter these moments, feelings, sensations, emotions daily, and that's my practice. And
yeah, as do I, because this is just part of being human. The question is, do we also have the awareness and the skills to work through it as efficiently, as effectively as possible? And our society has seen to it that we don't, right? Shame is something we all assume only I feel, more or less. And it's like a hot potato we never talk about. We don't get the language, not to mention all the other emotions that we should be talking about, like hurt, anger, and fear and clinging and so on. So this is key. And I would just also add that, I've emphasized the inside job in terms of learning how to shift out of the survival mode or stress mode that limits our capacity and into the well-being, engaged mode, the mammal mode that allows us to thrive. But we're not just talking about, this doesn't just impact our internal state of consciousness. It also translates in a different way of leading, a different way of doing business, right? And there are business applications, like real world, how do I deal with this business problem? How do I deal with this difficult interaction in my workplace? How do I deal with the energy drain or the burnout or whatever? And so we do also, as part of the Boundless Leadership program, teach applications that speed the translation of this new way of being into a new way of engaging in the workplace with others in the workplace.
I agree completely. So as we wind down and come to the end of our conversation, I want to try to squeeze in the experience of assuming and either being in nuance or shirking nuance. assumptions is quite important to me and personal to us as a company. Verifying stories and assumptions is one of the key behaviors underneath our core value of practice curiosity. And you say throughout your book, it's one of the most pernicious things, our deep-seated need to focus on validating our thinking, positive or negative, rather than just being open to discovering something new, as well as jumping to preconceived judgments of others without all the data. The misperceiving is one of the most toxic things that we can do in a business context or any interpersonal relationship. And then in terms of nuance, because I think the two are somewhat related, I found that a reluctance to stay in that uncomfortable gray area of nuance can lead to so many organizational and interpersonal dysfunctions. And you write that staying in clarity requires us to expose and remove even the insidious bias that subtle nuances don't matter. And I know this leads to a broader discussion around negativity bias and bias in general, to other groups. And so you talk also in detail in terms of how our nervous systems are evolved in part to do this as a contrast enhancer, and that actually, neurologically speaking, isn't possible for us to not have biases. So can you speak to how a team agility and team creativity are compromised in work cultures where there's a reduced capacity for nuance, also coupled with the fact that we're wired to make assumptions or predictions as we move through the world?
Yeah, so the way our nervous systems evolved to help us survive, thrive, to protect us, is there's two aspects that are a real problem for the full use of our intelligence, or accurate perception. So one is the tendency to exaggerate or to confuse an experience or something that I feel is true or happening with reality. So there's a natural part of our self-protective wiring is to think, if I thought I saw a tiger over there, I saw a tiger. And you can see why that would be useful if it really turned out to be a tiger, right? So this, what we call it the habit of reification, the habit of just thinking our experiences are reality and not being able to tell the difference between the two. And then we have the other part of it, which is this polarizing habit. And the polarizing habit is designed to really exaggerate the distinction between things, to sort of to categorize everything in terms of whether it's gonna save us or whether it's gonna kill us, right? Because if we're in survival mode, I'm not going to worry about the nuances. I just want to survive, right? So our stress mind highly exaggerates these two capacities. Both when we're in stress, we don't think very flexibly. We're not very open. We're rigid, stereotypical. We become dinosaurs, right? And we have this polarizing vision where I'm only interested in what's going to kill me or what's going to save me. And so, essentially this, biases come from, or assumptions come from the reifying habit, right? They come from this habit of exaggerating, of turning up an experience into a reality, right? That's the basic habit limiting our intelligence, our capacity to use our curiosity and learn new things. And then the other one, the loss of nuance, comes from the polarizing, right? Because I can't, I don't have the tolerance, this sense of safety to just open my mind and really take in the particularities, the unique textures of this moment with all its ambiguities and interrelationships. So these are both mental habits that are not good for complexity. They're not good for agility. They're the opposite. So everything we need to function more effectively in our present day, this 24/7 global economy, everything's changing all the time. Everything's interconnected. We need agility. We need, flexibility. And those capacities go out the door when we feel stressed. So there's another reason why we just can't afford it anymore. We can't afford to run our nervous systems on stress energy. It's just crippling. It completely handicaps the capacities that we really need. And that's why we need this whole new approach, because it's not so easy to undo, hundreds of millions of years of evolution. We can do it, but it doesn't just, it's not like snapping your fingers.
Yeah, it does at times seem Herculean. You mentioned the need for agility and flexibility. And you do use the word heroism at one point in the book. And I love the way you phrase it in terms of being an ordinary person in an extraordinary situation. And that we don't have to be special to inspire. We have to be in a special place within our nervous system. And that ultimately it's a way of leading without needing to impress or intimidate. And I just want to say as a side note that I've seen some of the most courageous acts of heroism via team members sitting in that fire of that uncomfortable vulnerability instead of in that stress-charged energy of shame, anger, and fear. And that's, my hat goes off to anyone, anywhere doing that. It's beautiful to watch. And
yeah, I mean, but to link it back to a point you mentioned very early, Derik, this is not something, it's something that's very hard for us as human beings to do in isolation. So while it's important that each person develop the skills of boundless leadership or this inner transformation, it's also important that the whole businesses and the culture at large, and a team, for example, be really ready to support this, right? Because it isn't just of course, if you're really strong, you can stay open while other people are closed, but you need to be very, very highly trained and capable in that. And that can be like, you can be the leader in the room at that moment. But of course, it's always easier when we're getting helping hands and we're all tuning into the same channel and, helping each other stay more open and nuanced and curious, and rather than reactive and closed.
Absolutely. And as we're all moving to more flat organizations, there still is always some amount of hierarchy. And if it isn't starting at the proverbial top, it definitely will be much harder for it to spread out throughout the rest of the organization. I imagine the incredible nuance and depth of your book and its supporting material would benefit tremendously from a program. And you have a program launching in February. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So all of the principles and practices that we pack into Boundless Leadership, we unpack in the Boundless Leadership program. And it's a 6-month program, totally online, with a very, very extensive learning site that has, I think around 70 videos and lots of readings. And essentially the most important piece in terms of in the very vein that we were just discussing is creating a community for learning and transformation, which you're not going to find anywhere. This is an unusual community of people that are ready to do this kind of inner transformation and help support us in the inner work that's necessary, the inner learning, the deep learning that's necessary to change. So Elazar and I love doing this work of Boundless Leadership, and the program really allows us to take people over this 6-month journey and really guide them through all the steps so that they can then develop their own sort of leadership plan, their own Boundless Leadership plan when they leave, and maybe have that to continue to refine over the years. So it's a very powerful experience that we love, and we sort of welcome anyone who may be interested in taking this journey with us.
And where can people find that? What's the website? Anyone who wants to dive deeper on what you said earlier in terms of the reification, the predictions, the categorization that we do, I believe either a week or two prior to your episode, we'll post our interview with Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, where she talks about emotions and how we're predictive organisms.
Great. It's Nalanda, boundlessleadership.org.
Great. We'll add that link to the show notes. Thank you, Dr. Loizzo. This was so wonderful, and thank you for doing this work, and I appreciate the time with you.
Thank you, Derik. Loved our conversation, and thanks for what you're doing.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you to our entire team behind the scenes at Glow. I'm so grateful for your care and commitment to serving our members around the world. Thank you to our teachers for so beautifully sharing your gifts and talents. I'm also grateful to our lovely community of Glow members. You've supported us since 2008, and because of you, we get to continue to do the work we love. It's the combined support of our team, our teachers, and our community that grants me the privilege to continue to bring you the Glow podcast. Thank you to Lee Schneider at Red Cub Agency for production support. And the beautiful music you're hearing now is by Carrie Rodriguez and her husband, Luke Jacobs. And remember, take care of yourself because our world needs you. Thank you for coming on this journey with me. You can find the Glow podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or glo.com/podcast, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Derik Mills.